Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Many years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Casey Jones, not the railroad engineer. He was a combination chemical engineer and mechanical engineer. And I'm privileged today to have with me his grandnephew, Spencer Balentine, who is carrying on the tradition of his granduncle, who was called the king of the moonshine whiskey still makers between the rivers. Spencer Balentine, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and to further Casey's story, and anytime that I can tell about Casey, or you know, because I use his handiwork every day now in my new business, so I'm really pleased to be here.
Silver Trail Distillery, it's called.
Yeah, and everything about our product, the bottle, even distillery, has a kind of a historic tie between the rivers. The Silver Trail was the, well, mainly now it's the trace, and but back in the 50s, when my dad was so active, and Casey and all the other guys on both sides of my family, basically, that was the main, I call it the Moonshine Mother Road into Clarksville, Tennessee. And because that's where they, on my family's side, that was their main outlet, was downtown Clarksville. And this thing was twisty, had kind of a white, like a creek gravel on it. And I can still, when I go down through there, I can still see me in the back of my dad's car, you know, and he always drove with heavy gas and a heavy brake, and those rocks flying, and because you'd meet yourself coming on this thing. So that's where the name came from. And it was called the Old Silver Trail before the trace.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the law has changed to where this is a legal institution. Explained in the process of making, and I hope this doesn't sound like a contradictory term, legal moonshine.
Well, it's been, for me, to get legal, it was 3 years and 2 months from the time I started this project. And my wife can tell you I gave up 3 times. and while we were giving up, you have to file 188 papers to the feds. You have to do that first. And when they reject you, they don't tell you why they reject you. And you just get this big bundle of papers back in the mail with a rejection stamp on it. So the last time I looked at it and I knew it was, and I just threw it across the room there, and she left it lay, you know, for about a week. Finally I go back, and the last time they accepted me. And but before that, it's kind of a leap of faith, because you have to build everything. I had to have the distillery intact, had to have the steel there, had to have everything except materials, where they could come in inspected. So the whole project was kind of a, you know, depended on some other process to pass. So it was quite an experience from just a legal filling out form standpoint. So.
Now, you did tell me that you are part of the Bourbon Trail and that you put up about 100 gallons of bourbon, but your main product is what we would call moonshine whiskey.
Oh yeah, the whole reason for this thing, the reason I started it, I had the recipe. I had a relative that kept up with this recipe, which came from my mom's side of the family. It'd be my great-grandfather. I can trace it back to him. And the whole idea of this thing was to see if I could recreate the recipe exactly like they did it in the 50s. And whether it was going to be great or horrible, I know I had some visitors in from Australia and Germany. Some distillers came by, and they did their test and everything, and they said, oh, it's got a good fragrance, a fruity flavor. And they looked at me and I said, I don't give a damn. And they said, well, why? And I said, look, the whole thing is to give somebody an experience of something that you could got only in 1950. And I said, whether it turned out horrible or great, like you say, you know, I said, luckily it turned out great, but that wasn't my goal, you know. It was to bring this little piece of history back. So.
Now, you've been in operation for how long?
I'd been legal about 14 months, and I'd actually been where I could sell, because in Kentucky you have a 3-tier system. We can make it, but I can't sell it. I can't really even, you know, buy ads for liquor stores that carry my product. But I have to sell it to a distributor in Louisville, So he picks it up there, trucks it to Louisville, and brings it back to Paducah and Cadiz and every place that's handling it. So it's kind of everybody has their little slice of the pie. And, when you start looking at the laws, it all goes back to in the 40s. After Prohibition, all this was carved up, and you can tell who had control of it was the large distilleries or want to get back in business. So they really put in a lot of protections that I've got that you know, a lot of businesses, you know, haven't.
Well, let's go back and talk about Casey Jones, and I would like to explain. We talked before about how I came to meet him. I did a series of articles. I used to write for the old Paducah Sun-Democrat and the Paducah Sun. I did a series of articles on moonshining. One of them was a man named Reg Nickel, who was from Lyon County, who was a relative of David Nickel, one of my colleagues here, and then John Bays, who was a revenue agent, and then Casey Jones. And after I finished my interview with John Bays, he said, you really need to go and seek out Casey Jones to interview him. And I said, that sounds great. And he lives near Aurora. And I looked him up in the phone book, he wasn't there. So I told Barkley Tillman, our photographer, I said, let's just go seek him out. So we drove over there, drove up in the yard of this trailer, asked directions, found out where it was, and he was in the yard. And I said, are you Casey Jones? And he looked at me and didn't say a word. And I said, well, I'm looking for Casey Jones. Didn't say a word. And I said, well, the Casey Jones I'm looking for made a lot of whiskey stills between the rivers, and John Bays told me I should look him up. And he smiled and said, well, if John Bays sent you, I'll talk to you. Of course, John arrested him for making stills. We spent 2 of the most enjoyable hours. We had a ball. That's one of the most enjoyable stories I ever did. And Barkley Tillman, who is retired from the Sun, took a photograph of him that was one of the most incredible photographs I ever saw. And Casey has on a bib overalls. He's got his hat on, kind of tilted back, and he's smoking a cigarette like this. It was a tremendous picture. I love that story. And I later on resurrected it. I wrote for the Associated Press and then also for a magazine, and I understand you have a copy of it.
I do, and then one thing I did do, you were talking about the photograph, I made it into a, like a 4x4 poster, and it's right in the middle of the distillery there. And he's got one thing on there that none of my uncles really remembered, and he had like a chain.
He did.
Hooked, and I guess that was his wallet that was in, or watch
chain or something. You're exactly right. I remember that now.
And everybody comes in there, you know, what is that? Because it looks kind of cool.
It does, yeah. It's either his watch chain or it's on his wallet. Yeah, absolutely. Well, now tell us the story of him. I think he told me he lived in Franklin Hollow down in Trigg County, not far from Golden Pond. How did he get into this? And he was a master at this, obviously. How did he get into it?
Well, he was always, one of my older uncles and I discussed it quite a bit, that if he could have met up with some guy like Henry Ford, they could have owned the world, basically, because he was such just a natural mechanical genius and a chemical genius. He just, and what people find hard to believe on the stills, he never used a ruler. What he did, he had like, say if you needed a three barrel, which is like 73 gallons like the one behind us, he had sticks cut and lay them out, you know, on the copper. Of course, all the copper came flat, you know, wasn't anything rolled back then. And he'd lay them out and cut it off.
I remember him saying that, yeah. He also said, on the topic of copper, I said, where did you get your sheet copper? He said, I got it from Petter Supply in Paducah. And I said, did they know what you were using it for? He said, they didn't ask.
Oh, funny thing, when I started building the distillery, I wanted a replica of Casey, and I looked up, and there was a guy who was 84 and he built my still that had worked for Casey back in the 40s and early 50s. And he said, well, you got to round me up some copper first before we get started. So he remembered that name, and I called down there, and I said, I need a 4x10 sheet of copper, you know, like a 22 gauge. And there's a long silence on the phone. And they said, well, we have flashing for a roof. And so I ended up, I had to go straight to the copper factory in Tennessee to pick up that style of copper.
Right,
right. But he got it as close as, of course, he didn't have the workmanship that Casey had, but he used the same tools like Casey used, the old running irons and the the old 1940s blow torches, you know, Casey would keep 2 of them going, so he'd keep his sorter running. And the funniest thing, I had to use all food grade sorter in it, and back then they used, I guess it was a lead-based sorter or something on them, and it heated at 200 degrees. Well, the old guy called me, or had his son call me, and said, "What's wrong with this sorter?" Or it's 400 degrees for food grade. So I said, "That's what we have to use, you know." So
I think, Spencer, he told me, and I may be wrong, that they cut up ball mason fruit jar lids for their solder.
yeah, yeah, for the tinning of it, or what they call it.
They did.
Yeah.
Well, now, so when he made his first still, had he been around this? He knew what stills looked like and how to do this?
The story that I've always got that someone had and I never did find out who, like one of his peers had been left Golden Pond and went someplace and had saw one of these things work, you know, a round pot, and so he brought the design back to a Joe Bogard there in Golden Pond.
Yeah.
And he was a big operator.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he even had labels for his bottles and had a 24/7 shift, you know.
Yeah.
And this back in the 20s and in the early 30s. Well, Casey, from what I understand, you know, looked at this design and he said, "Well, that's not really very, for what we're needing, that's really not efficient, this big round pot." So he designed this one with the handles on it, where 2 guys could actually take this whole rig, be in the woods and run it. And he made it fast running too, which the round pots are not fast running. And when I say fast running, 4 minutes to 1 gallon of whiskey. And where everything else, even the modern round pots, about 18 to 20 minutes is all you're gonna get. So he kind of put his touches on it, and then he really got renowned, you know. And his fee was, I think my uncle said, $75, but you had to provide him a place to stay and meals while he's doing the job for you.
Yeah, right. And again, you were talking about the fast running. He told me that this thing would fit in the bed of a wagon for a quick getaway.
Yeah.
And you got the handles on it where you could grab it and get. Well, he said, you know, now when the revenuers come, he said, you've got to escape with your copper.
Yeah.
Leave the rest of that stuff behind, but the copper, that's the
most valuable.
That's the most valuable part of it. Yeah. Well, then, if you would, you mentioned recipe, give us a step-by-step process of how you make moonshine whiskey of the 1950s vintage. Just from the very beginning, just take it from there.
Well, the first thing, my family always used a certain type of corn. And now you see these modern recipes on the internet, and they say go down to the co-op and just buy, they call it chicken scratch or like a cracked corn. Well, the problem with that now is that, which they didn't have back then, is all this corn has a Roundup resistance. So when you boil that stuff up and hold it up, you got green strings running in it. So my first chore, and it was a hard one in Marshall County, you would think that, as a matter of fact, 4 miles from me, my friend's got probably 3 million bushels, you know, as a grain dealer. He said, you can't use any of it. So I went to Murray, some of my friends up there. No, we don't make food grade corn. We don't, there's not enough demand for it. So I looked on the internet and ended up in a little town called Trenton, Kentucky, on the Clarksville border. I've been in business since 1930. So they had it. I went in, I said, I want corn like your grandmother would can, you know. So they said, yeah, that's what we specialize in. So I got the corn. And then when I got it back, one of my uncles was in there and he was looking at the name on the bag. He said, that's where your grandmother at the store bought all her corn, 1950. So, I mean, I've got the exact ingredient. So once you have your corn, then you do everything we do is natural. And I guess the reason they did it that way, because all they had to work with was the wood, you know. So they'll sour this corn, and then they'll put their sugar.
Well, now how do you sour the corn? How does that work?
All you do, just heat up some water and put so much in the bottom of the barrel, and then let it set for 5 days.
And what does it do to the corn?
Well, it kind of, like I say, just basically sours it. You look down and see all these spores and everything. When it really gets to smelling, I think it smells good, and my wife thinks it smells horrible. When it gets smelling horrible, then you put your recipe on it. And
okay, then the recipe. Now go, yeah. Now what's that?
The recipe, which basically is hot water and a certain amount of sugar and a certain amount of fresh corn, you know, more corn. and then our special yeast. I've got a special yeast we use. And
now he told me in those days that they preferred Flashmans from a grocery store.
Yeah. And then I've heard my uncle say that they did use McCormick.
Oh.
And then I had another uncle said that during the war they couldn't get sugar, so they used Burr Rabbit syrup.
Molasses. They did.
Molasses,
he told me that. They used molasses. They sure did.
They said, you talk about bitter, you think it'd be sweet. They said it was pretty rough.
Yeah.
You get the proof.
So this barrel, how many gallons would your mash barrel, how many gallons?
Well, that's where you get your size of your cooker, and the perfect size for a micro distillery, somebody wants to start small, is a 1 barrel. And the reason...
and the barrel, how many gallons?
Oh, you'd get about, on your first run, you'd have about 42 gallons.
Mm-hmm.
Or this one, you can squeeze 3 barrels in it, but it doesn't leave you much surface. So I'm telling everybody, you know, if they have one built like this, 2.5 barrel, figure on that.
Mm-hmm.
But the 1 barrel is so efficient. I know right now, I've got a friend that started a still company. We're calling it Casey Stills, and we're figuring on a small distillery in Maryland. And he said, well, what do you recommend? I said, well, you need a 1 barrel, and the reason I say that, because you run all your mash in it, you know, run your product out, and then you take that mash, put it back in your barrel, and then you're ready again, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it keeps everything, you don't waste anything that way.
Mm-hmm. So the process of souring takes about how long?
Well, if you start out, say today, it'll be 12 days before you can run your first gallon.
Okay.
Because that has sour, and then you put your recipe on it, then that has to what's called work. And all it is natural alcohol, you know, fermentation alcohol, which back then, they didn't have any gauges like I do. They do several different things. Either the taste of it, and if it was bitter, it was ready, or either they put their fingers in it and then go like that, and if it's sticky, it wasn't ready. You know, if it wasn't sticky, it's ready.
They call it, I believe he told me they call it a goop.
That was a term between the lakes. I've never heard any other distillery call it goop. But yeah.
And it also been called beer too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had a lot of guys that would hang around a still site just to drink the goop.
Yeah, I saw a fellow do that one time, and I thought, he said, you want some? I said, no, I'm okay with that.
It's horrible. I don't like lager beer anyway. But
it had a dark color. It looked almost like a Guinness or something.
Yeah, it's really brown looking.
Yeah,
and,
it was not, I didn't think very palatable, but he did, so there we are. So everything's ready to go. And then your recipe is set. You're all set to put it in the still. Then what do you do?
Well, those, I told you 2 ways you could tell. The way that my dad always checked, you'll have a head on there. You know, when you set it up, it looks almost like a pie crust. And well, when this pie crust look falls away and you see green liquid, well, that's another way it's ready. Mm-hmm. But back then, which I've got pumps for this too, they'd take like a bucket and just start filling the still up. And of course, I've got manholes in my still. Well, this one they'd have it uncapped. Mm-hmm. They'd fill that up and.
Well, now show us on the still. They would take the gooseneck off and pour it in.
Yeah, take the lead pipe off. And have to go in your main opening right there.
Right.
And but they would fill it up, and then something that really I've never even today. A lot of the modern distilleries don't filter their mash. See, that's I guess one of our family secrets. We filter it out going in there too, because the reason we do that, if we got any solids, even though it's ground corn, if you get any solids in there, what's it going to do is like burning the bottom of corn on the stove. You know?
Right, popcorn.
It's horrible, horrible taste.
So did you filtered it through what, a cloth or?
Just like they'd use like an old T-shirt or something back then.
Yeah, just through a cloth.
Filter through there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And
or I have a real fine screen today.
Right. But and then I believe Casey told me they would seal that with dough.
Flour paste.
Yeah, flour paste.
That's the way I do mine, the one that we made, and how they figured that out is really neat, because if you get a steam leak, all you do, and you think you'd burn yourself, but you just put that on your finger and touch it, and it bakes it on there.
Yeah,
so instant
it's a
seal.
Self-sealing. Yeah. Okay, now that thing you put a fire under it, but you got to be careful about how did they regulate the temperature? I'm assuming it was a wood fire, just logs. How would they regulate the temperature to make sure they didn't burn it up?
Well, of course, whiskey starts running at about 173 in the head part up here. I've got a laser thermometer I put on that, and I get it 173. I don't want it over 200. It'll start dripping. And well, what they did, they would watch if they saw any steam coming out down here, then they know they've got too hot. And they had a guy, I know, my dad said that he and his brothers, everybody had a job. They had a fireman, and then they had the bucket guy, and the worst job was the bucket guy for the condenser, because you've always got to have cold water going into the barrel that would surround this. They had like a plug down there, and when that thing got to going, you were busy. You know, you're running, and somebody's pulling the plug,
So when the mash is in the cooker there, and then of course it begins to bubble and boil and produces steam, and it comes up through the gooseneck into that condenser. Now that condenser, I was told by other moonshiners, was quite innovative, that it is so much more efficient than coils, that the production, and this is where I think he would have won a Nobel Prize in chemistry for the incredible output. And you told me that was inspired, it's a North Carolina design. So how did he come up with that idea?
Well, I have my uncle on my dad's side of the family, my oldest uncle, had spent some time courtesy of the federal government in North Carolina. And back then, if you received a year and a day, which was standard moonshine sentence, it was 9 months. So he had 9 months to work on this, talk to those guys down there. So he came back with this thing written on, I guess back then they had that old rough, not toilet paper, but the hand towels with it sketched out on it. And I'd give anything if I could find that sketch. But he got with Casey, and Casey said, "Yeah, that's really, really works." So the first one they turned out was a single one like this, which would have been probably 49 or maybe even 1950. But his later ones, they went, which is what I've got. They've got a double condenser design, and the advantage on that, I mean, you're putting out twice the output, so you got twice the speed.
So again, the steam condenses, and it begins to come out the little opening here. And then what? How do you? I know that the first whiskey off, you don't touch, you don't deal with. That's the bad stuff, right? Then how does that work?
Well, what you're doing, you're getting the easy stuff off at first, which is the gases, and I think there's a name for it, like butyls or something. But on my I've got a 300-gallon still, and then I've got the 200-gallon like this, and I'll throw away the first half gallon on this and the first gallon on the 300-gallon. And what it is, you can run that off and set it aside, and all the rest of the whiskey will be clear, just clear as creek water. But this will be almost a bluish white. So it's whatever the bad stuff, it gets it off first, and that's the reason you can't use it. Besides, the taste is horrible. And I'll normally hold off then maybe 2 more gallons, and see if it's going to clear up good. And then if those sit there and they're really clear like I want it, then I'll start dumping those. And then I'll dump. I've got a proofer on it, which a lot of the old shiners had never saw a proofer on the end of a still, and all it is, it routes it through there and then runs your hydrometer up and down, and it kind of keeps you straight where you're at in your run. And
I've heard other veteran moonshiners say if you knew what you were doing, you could tell with the bubbles. They call it checking the beads. How do the bubbles? What do the bubbles tell you?
Well, you see it a lot on these TV shows, where they'll hold it up and shake it. But they have to really to know what they're looking for. Like if you've got around 100 proof, you can shake it, and then the way I do it, I can count how long the bubbles stay. Like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. 100 proof is about 12. Count to 12, But if you got 150 proof, you look at how fast they fly away from the middle, and then they disappear. So 150 can fool you and look like almost 70 or 80 proof. Unless you know what you're looking for, you look for the speed of the way it disappears.
Now in the old days, I understand they sold the whiskey in they call them fruit jars. I did in East Tennessee, where my dad's from, and it was in glass. Now nowadays, a lot of this moonshine is in plastic milk jugs. Does that affect the taste of it?
It does, and I found that out, kind of expensive lesson, because I got all food grade barrels. Well, you have to get and I didn't realize this after the fact, you have to get a yellow one if you're going to hold liquid like that won't leach any kind of plastic taste. Well, I filled a 50-gallon white plastic one up and had to dump every bit of it because it tastes just like a plastic, like chewing on plastic. So that is a fact.
Yeah. Well, I again, in fact, David and I were talking about that. A lot of that stuff you see, it's just the white milk jugs, and that's got to affect the taste.
Oh, it does. If it sits there a week, I'd dump it.
Yeah. Now, your distillery is set up near Aurora, which of course is Casey Jones' country. Some other stories about him that came to mind. There was a story a moonshiner told me that he built a still inside a house one time, and the still was so valuable they had to cut a hole in the roof to get it out. You've heard that story?
I have. They said that he built it and got it all done. It was so big they couldn't get it out the little door.
Right, and so they cut a hole in the roof. And that's how valuable it was.
Yeah.
Well, now, how many years did he operate over there, about?
I've heard from the early 40s or maybe even late 30s all the way up, so it had to be at least a 15-year run, maybe even 20 there on that when they were so active. I know the funniest still I ever thought, the story that he made, there was a boy there, a good friend of my dad's, and he was kind of on the wild side, so he commissioned Casey to build one in his parents' living room. So Casey gets all set up. And the heck of it was, this guy's father was a game warden, a local game warden, and he never knew. He told me he was building him something for his car, and he never knew until he got it finished and out,
Oh, that's a great story. Well, now, tell us the history of this one. That is an original Casey Jones. It's obviously some weather beaten. Yeah. So how did you come by this thing?
If one thing really came a bonus for being on the TV show, we were filming in Aurora inside the little still house there, which got the bars on it.
Yeah.
And we were up there for nearly a day, and they didn't show any of that. Maybe they will sometime. But an older lady drove by and saw me in there. and so that night the phone rings, and my wife answered it, and she thought the lady was under the impression that you couldn't sell one of these unless the fellow who we were selling to was legal, legal distillery. So she says, I think I've got something that he might want. So she told me, gave me a number to call, so I called her, and I said, yeah, I definitely want to look at it. So I go over there, and they've got it set up behind their shed there, just like this, and I nearly fall over, it's an original Casey. And the way she came by it, she was like a sister-in-law or kind of distant relative to Casey, and like an in-law, distant, and had been in her garage for 45 years, standing on its end. And I said, well, how in the world did you keep anybody from stealing it? And she said that all these tires were stacked up perfectly, like it looked like the end of the garage, and this thing was like a, like
a hidden room.
Hidden room, back in there.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Well, getting back to that still you referred to in front of the Hitchin Post gift shop there, the story I heard was that this still was confiscated by law officers, and they put it out there, and somebody stole it and put it back in operation, and they got it back with the proviso that they fill it with concrete.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a kid thinking, why is there concrete coming out of this thing?
Right.
And it's in a little, it's behind bars.
Behind bars, yeah.
Now, I believe, doesn't that one have the double condenser on it?
It does. Matter of fact, that's the one that I know Sue, the people that own the Hitchin Post, had just bought it when I started my project. So I go up there, and you can kind of, well, I shouldn't say it, but you can kind of get in there, So I was out there measuring, making pictures of it, and I could see them looking out, what's this guy doing there still? So I got all the measurements, and then later I went back and I said, well, I wasn't up to no good. I was, doing measurements. So, but I couldn't see down in there. And so we had the first condensers I had made, we made them too small, on the inside, because you couldn't see down in there. Mm-hmm. So, but later, after I got this one, we reworked everything, and it works great, like it's supposed to.
Did some of them, I'm thinking maybe he told me some of these stills had 2 goosenecks and had condensers on each end. Did you ever see one of those?
Well, no, the one that I've had a guy, and I modified mine. This guy was telling me about it. He made them with a double condenser with a valve here, and what the reason that was for, that the whole idea is keeping your condenser cool. Well, if you run them out there, you can run this one until it gets hot, then turn it off, switch this one on,
And
back and forth there, so
right,
it
right.
makes it.
That's real chemical engineering. But you missed about the sticks. I was told the same thing, that he did not use a carpenter's rule, which would have been available to do that. So you got an award for Moonshine. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that really kind of kicked this whole project in gear for me on a pretty big scale. And about a year ago, it'll be a year ago next. In November, I decided to on a lark to enter this contest, and it's like the Oscars for distilled spirits. You know, you see names like Four Roses and and all the big guys in there. And my wife said, "Oh, you're wasting a $300 entry fee," and they had to send in 3 bottles, you know, of this 100 proof. And I said, "Well, I'm going to do it anyway. You know, what the heck?" So I sent it in, and this was like November. Well, in May, I get an email, and it says, "Congratulations." Well, I started to delete it, and I thought, no, because I forgot about it, really. And so I read it, and it says, well, "Congratulations, Silver Trail is the gold medal winner for unaged spirits for Moonshine in the unaged spirits class." And I read it.
Unaged spirits?
Yeah. That was a class, unaged spirits. So I'm looking at it, and about the second time, and then I finally get myself off the floor, you know. And I called the girl and I said, "Is that some kind of mistake?" And she said, "No." So we're sending your gold medal out, you know, with little stickers. So
Wow.
I immediately looked up the number 2, you know, who got the silver medal, and it was a distillery in North Carolina. And I looked them up on the website, and they must have had like a $3 million building with a $100,000 still. And here I've got a pole barn in Marshall County, you know.
Wow.
And my cousin said, "Well," he said, "it's not what you cook it in, it's what the recipe is." And I think that recipe combined with the authenticness of the still, you know, it just turned out. So.
Now, you mentioned, of course, the term unaged spirit. Well, back during Prohibition, they're trying to sell some of this stuff as actually aged whiskey.
Yeah.
How did they get it to look like Scotch or rye whiskey or Canadian whiskey? How did they get that beautiful amber color to it?
My grandfather was from what I hear, was a master at that. And he had it down to, he'd take one of those old, like an early hand lathe, and you had to use oak chips, and he would get an oak board and just make these chips off. And then he would line them up on a tray and put brown sugar on them. Then slide them in the oven and cook them till the things are just, they nearly look like they're burned up. And then he'd drop them, he'd lay a shine out in a pretty good sized pan and sprinkle all this in there and put it in the window. And they said in about 3 days, that was the honeyest, you know, colored, best looking.
Wow.
And they said it was pretty good too. He would cut it back to about 80 and then put that on there, and probably just like an amateur drinker, you'd probably think it's fine bourbon, you know, been aged 10 years. So.
Yeah. Of course, you know, with the bourbon process, the barrels are charred, and it takes, well, gosh, minimum of 6 years, 8. Of course, the older, but these guys are in a hurry. They're trying to get this stuff out. And so they would take that stuff and put it in bottles, and here's Canadian whiskey, here's Scotch, whatever.
Make a label. And,
wow. So he could do in 3 days what it would take a distiller 6 years. That's innovative.
Now, there was another guy at Katie's, and Mr. Calhoun had told me this story, that there's only 2 of them made, but this Bogart fella had patented, he said it had a U.S. patent on it, this deal that it was kind of like ionization would be today, and it was about so long and had these huge wires on it, and you drop it down in your barrel, and some way this thing would create like lightning in there and age it in, I think he said it took maybe a week or so, but it sat there and just
wow.
and do it that way. He said there was 2 in existence, and I think he has one of them. And it's in this fancy, looks like a violin case. But this Bogart fella had it all. You know,
well, now he is, of course, the legendary. I mean,
Yeah.
he is the #1. You hear all these stories about him. Are they true?
Everything I'd heard on both sides of the family that, yeah, it was about the, now you've heard stories about, you know, Capone flying guys into behind Golden Pond and picking it up, but what I'd heard, that was the buyers, and then they actually had to truck it up, you know, Chicago, so.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't get enough on them little planes back then.
Oh, no, no.
They couldn't take off, so.
So they would truck it up to Chicago in
Yeah.
what, in just tanker trucks?
No, they, now between the Rivers whiskey, and I've never heard any difference on this, and I know my dad used exclusively, was the ring handle jugs. And that's the reason that on my jug, I looked forever to find a ring handle jug. And a lot of people asked me, yeah, that's like the Moonshiner turns it up. And I said, no, it's portability. Because my dad always said, you're no good at a shiner unless you can put one on each finger and thumb, you know, and come out of the woods with it. And he could do it. I can barely do my 1 liters on there, but
Yeah.
but he could do that. And it made it easy to stack it in their cars. You know, they would take the back seat out, and he could put 200 gallons, you know, all the way back, and you know, to the trunk, because
Right.
it's all open.
Right.
And he'd take that thick butcher paper and line each one of them, and then that really brings me to my first moonshine memory. I guess memory of anything. I was about 5, and he was leaving on one of his runs. He always loaded at the store there on Highway 68. And I remember just pestering my mom, you know, let me ride to the house with him before he goes to Clarksville. So finally she said, okay, because it wasn't 2 miles. And so they set me in front seat there, and I remember my feet being on these like 4 or 5 jugs in the floorboard. And then, of course, he drove like he always did. He spun up the hill, his gravel drive, and stopped in front of the house, just got on the brake. And of course, this sound of that 200 jugs just clunk, clunk. That just, you know, stuck in my head. Yeah.
What kind of car did he have? Was it a hot rod?
No, it looked pretty normal. Just a black. Matter of fact, I've got it on the only picture that I've got of it on the cap of the jug. It was a 52 black Chevy. So.
52, so that'd be a
Yeah.
6-cylinder engine then.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been a hot rod.
No, no.
Well, you know, you hear stories about the roots of NASCAR, these guys running moonshine out of the hills of North Carolina, Junior Johnson and some of these guys. Were there any local guys who had souped up cars that did it that way?
One of my dad's friends actually tried the dirt track in there, and he didn't like all the rules and regulations, so that's the only guy that I remember him talking about.
That had a hot rod and did it.
My dad, what his thing was in suspension. My uncle had designed some kind of little, or he found them someplace, little air boots, and they would air those things up, and it looked normal going down the road, you know, this, what would be 1,600 pounds, 200 gallons in there, and then when he got back, all he had to do was let the air out in his back.
You know, there was actually a company called Airlift, and they used for racing cars, and they were, you're right, they were rubber boots and suspension.
Yeah, it went inside the springs.
Absolutely did, and that was for racing purposes. Because I know that you want to be riding level like that.
Yeah, when you go through town, you know, you don't want to be set.
Exactly, it's pretty obvious what you got. Of course, another story I've heard way back when there were no bridges across the Tennessee and the Cumberland, that the ferry operators kind of watched out for suspicious people they may thought would be revenuers. Have you heard those stories too?
Yeah, yeah. I'd heard of one where the bridge, I don't know if they had like a toll bridge at Cumberland River.
It was a toll bridge. Both those bridges were
one of
toll
those
bridges.
guys was killed, and they never solved the murder. And back
I've
in the
heard
40s.
that.
Yeah.
Was that on the Canton Bridge?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that story. Yeah. But the story I heard was that again, the ferry operators were kind of in cahoots with the moonshiners, and they would there was a signal. Getting back to John Bays, the guy who arrested Casey Jones, have you heard any stories about him?
Well, I can tell you two that were my personal, and one of them, my mom and I were leaving my grandmother's store there on 68 one night, and
now that store where was that store exactly?
It was called Five Oaks Grocery, and they had like a little cafe there. But you know, like if you're going to Katie's, the big hill, I'd call it. It's gradual, but it's a big hill going in the Golden Pond. It would have been right there on the left, where you can actually see the buffalo and the elk and bison range. There, so it's set right there on 68. The old parking lot's still there, and we were coming. She had like oh, maybe 4 steps coming out of the store. And I was on about the 3rd one. And this guy, and they always wore these big green, well, they looked big to me at the time, big green uniforms and everything. He said, son, well, what's your daddy doing with all that butcher paper? And I said, he's covering up his barrels. And my mother never grabbed me as hard and spun me around and said, get back in the store. So, and the other one, my dad and uncle set up shop in a little building behind the house, which everybody called a smokehouse, you know, where they're made to hang meat and everything and smoke it. And he worked there all winter. And one morning when they were taking their discarded mash out, my uncle said, look at that. And a widow woman lived just maybe 300 yards, and she was out at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, well, we're caught. So they went back and they knocked it all down. Sure enough, I remember the guy rolling up in his government issue car, getting out and knocking on the door. And he said, well, Tom, he'd look around a little bit. And he said, go right ahead. So we followed him around. And we got to the smokehouse, you know. And my dad opened it up. And I remember, you know, wanting to say, what are my toys doing in here? And so I could see my dad kind of push me back. So the guy said, well, it looks like you cleaned it up good, and he left. So,
oh, that's
so that
funny.
was my 2 with the revenue.
Yeah. Speaking of the discarded mash, what did they do with that? Just dump it on the ground, or?
Just dump it, yeah. 'Cause it's really not any good. You would think there'd be a lot of sugar in it, but it's not. It's just foul, you know.
Yeah.
Corn, like a boiled corn left over. So.
Now, what was your dad's name?
Thomas.
Yeah.
Everybody
Is he still living?
Thomas. No, he's been gone about 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then my mom's been gone about 11 years, and I know his last run, and from that time till they passed away, they never talked about it. I mean, that was part of their life that she hated it, and that's just something they didn't speak about. So.
Well, you know, that's a funny thing, and I had interviewed other moonshiners, and there were 2 groups, those who would tell everything and those in total denial.
Right.
And to go back to the interview I did with Reg Nickel, I was off on Mondays. This story ran in the Sunday Paducah Sun, and so Tuesday morning, this man came into the newsroom. I mean, he was ballistic, furious. And he came up to me and said, "You write that story?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "I'm going to sue you." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes." He said, "They never made 1 drop of whiskey between the rivers in Lyon County." I said, "Really?" He said, "Absolutely so." He said, "Besides that," he said, "you know that drawing you had of the still in the paper? That gooseneck was wrong." And I said, "Oh, you know something about this?" "Well, I'm not proud of it." And so, but again, and I had a man also tell me, absolutely straight-faced, there was no whiskey ever made around Golden Pond. He said it was all fiction, it was all a lie, wasn't true. And I said, whatever. So you got this total denial.
That's right.
And then going back to B.J. Hooks, and when I was interviewing him, I said, "Did you make any moonshine?" "Well, a little bit." Well, I come to find out later he made more than a little bit. So again, it's this either you tell everything like Reg Nickel did, or you're in total denial.
Yeah. Well, like my family story, I was telling somebody, they called me about this TV show thing, and I said, "Look," I said, "that was just a tiny part of what went on between the lakes." And my older uncle got figuring up, and he said at one time there was like 2,800 gallons a week going out of there. So my family couldn't have made just a fraction of that,
right.
But it was all over, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they could deny it, but anybody that was born over there, and I lived over there till I was 10 years old, you're connected to it, you know, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
So.
Was that area between the rivers, was it the isolation that made it ideal for this? Because moonshine was made in every state in the Union. There was moonshine made, and there have been moonshine made in the eastern part of Trigg County and Callaway, Graves, all over the place. Was it the isolation, the fact you got these 2 rivers, you've got this peninsula, and before bridges, it's really isolated. It's a great place to make it.
I think what it was more than anything, and from my dad's point of view anyway, it was a way to, you know, just make a living. Because back then, I'd heard him tell about that it was just tough to find a job. You know?
Right.
And,
right.
And I think that was everybody's mindset. They were just so self-reliant that, you know, we're not going to ask for anything. We're just going to make it. And I think one of the things that proved that out when they bought them all out, there wasn't any mortgage on any of those homes, 1,000 homes with no mortgages, you know, and the government couldn't believe that, you know.
And see, another thing too about whiskey is it's more portable. Yeah. And I teach Kentucky history, and we're talking about Booker's Moonshine, or synonymous with Kentucky. And I said, now which is more valuable, a bushel basket of cracked corn or shell corn, or a bushel basket of whiskey? And it's obvious that it is. And you go back in history, farmers made whiskey. It really augmented their income. Well, back in the, obviously during Prohibition, they would have gotten a higher price for it. What do you think kept moonshine going beyond Prohibition? Once Prohibition is lifted in 1933, whiskey's legal again, but moonshining, it goes on to the 40s, 50s, and I guess they were making it right up to the time that LBL came in there. Why do you think it was still popular and still popular today?
I think the last still that I'd heard of that was confiscated was in '65 maybe, and everybody was out by '66 or '67. But no, I think it's just the whole idea that it's so in our culture, you know, all the way back. And interesting thing I'd read about, you know, was the brand that George Washington did, you know, the rye brand.
Right, and in fact, on that program, they had the thing about the rye whiskey that he made.
I think that, and the reason that program is so successful, that everybody has always heard about it in some form, you know. And I think it's just something that's purely American. And that's the reason I want to bring our brand back so well, because that's really purely between the lakes, you know, made like it did, the recipe. So I think that's what it is. It's just something that's in people, you know. And
it's such a part of the history of this state. But again, when you think of whiskey in Kentucky, you think of bourbon, which is a whole different process. But yet this is also a part of Kentucky. And now I always heard, I mean, you know how you hear things, that the whiskey between the rivers was in smaller quantities but higher quality. That on the other hand, in eastern Kentucky, it was more quantity and less quality. Now even John Bays told me that, and he said up there that these were big operations. And something else he told me, which I thought was interesting, was he said that all the moonshiners he arrested between the rivers, there was no violence involved. And he said, I'd arrest the guy. I said, now Bill, next Wednesday at 10 o'clock, you need to be in federal court in Paducah. Okay, and they'd show up. He said in East Tennessee, there was gunplay. Why do you think that culture was different like that? Any ideas?
Well, I think that it goes back to taking pride in what you do. I think that, I know from my dad's standpoint, it was all about, you know, getting the recipe right. You know, and like you say, they took pride in it. And the part about, I know at one time they got a lot of whiskey, or heard about a lot of whiskey out of Tennessee that was actually blinding people. And what it was, they were using those old car radiators and leaching all the lead and everything else out of it.
That's awful.
But they insisted on, you know, the good corns and, you know, doing it right. So.
Well, you know, it's funny you'd mentioned that, and we were talking about that, and he said, now, you never want to use sheet steel, Casey told me, because it's galvanized, and that leaches off into the batch. And he said good whiskey is made in copper. And if you think about distilleries, and I've toured distilleries even in Scotland, it's copper.
Yeah, it's all copper.
What is it that why is copper so good as a metal?
It is something about the way that the copper, that one of the old distillers told me, the way that it reacts to that chemical you know, process, that it actually that the whiskey actually takes something from the copper. I know if you look at their tower stills, like in Maker's Mark, they're probably 2 stories high, and the guy that builds them, that's building my little stills now, he said he worked on those at Vendome, and if you look down in one, they have like plates, you know, like big plates that go out, because they're probably 3 foot around. And he said in each one of those, it'll be like cut up piece of copper at no certain size, just dumped in there. So they actually want it steaming up through the copper and then condensing back into the copper. So it's got a property there that just adds something to it that, I know you can taste a whiskey done on a stainless steel, and it's just kind of bland. It's almost like Everclear, you know, something you put in to what they make hooch with, you know, to give it some taste. So
Right. Well, now tell us a little bit more about your operation. I mean, how does it work? I mean, you're the master distiller, obviously. Do you have employees? I mean, and what is your production rate for a week, let's say?
Oh, I'm putting in a new mashing room, which all it is a room capable of holding 50 mash barrels. Right now I run between 9 and 20, and I've got two stills. I've got the Casey design, and I have a commercial still to do the 80 proof on, which has got a tower on, 12-foot tower, and it'll handle up to well, just under 10 barrels. So with both of them running, I can turn out over 100 gallons a week. But
well, now you mentioned the barrels. Now, traditionally it's white oak. Are these white oak barrels?
no, the reason they went with those kind of barrels back then because you know, they couldn't use the regular old steel barrels, you know, to do your mashing because they rust up and everything. It wouldn't taste right. But I use a food grade white barrel to mash it in.
Made of white.
Yeah, they're like a white food grade, like you'd mix up at a restaurant, like they'd mix up a slaw in.
Oh, made out of plastic.
Yeah, but they're 50 gallons, and the reason I do that because you'll end up with about 40 gallons of usable mash. That's what you'll pump off.
So I was going to ask you about the. I believe Casey told me that the barrels they use are around 50, 55 gallons.
Yeah.
And you get how much out of that?
You'll get about 40 because you think about it, you don't have that much corn and sugar and everything else in the bottom of it. So.
Now you're online.
Yeah.
Which that would surely have amazed Casey, this whole idea of online and
it would have. Now, another quick story I'll tell you about Casey. He was the first man to have electricity between the lakes. You might have heard that. But he owned it was kind of a wild bar there later on in the 50s, but in the 40s, he and his wife owned it, and it was called the Flat Top. And
where was that?
It was from where my grandmother's store was. It'd been about another mile on back towards the Aurora side, and between the lakes there on 68. And they had, I don't know, sandwiches and I'm sure they had some kind of drinks too. But anyway, they said that he went up the hill there. If you look off down there, there's a hill, a little holler and then a hill up there, and built him like a substation. And he had, I think my uncle said, 24 car batteries in there. Had them all synced together. And then he had a tractor, a motor out of a tractor with a radiator sitting here. Well, he would, and he run a wire from all his batteries down to I call it a roadhouse, flat top. And they had he said they had an old jukebox in there. And when the jukebox would start, really winding down, that Casey had a flat iron with a rope tied to it. He would set that on the floor. Well, it would kick the starter in for this engine. He said it'd go pop, 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 and said the lights come right back up. So
wow.
He'd figured all that out. Made his own homemade generator, and then the batteries and the lights. So.
He also told me that he invented a gas-fired cooker. But the problem was it sounded like a jet plane.
It was so loud.
And that it would attract the revenuers. Do you have anything, would there be any of those left around anywhere?
I've looked for one of those because I've heard my dad tell me many times that, you hear about whiskey stills blowing up. Well, it wasn't a whiskey still, it was the heat source. And matter of fact, one of those, my uncle was telling me just yesterday, had blown up back in the early 70s and killed 2 guys. Around Aurora, and
so what part explodes? I mean, what?
Well, what it's telling me that they would do, grease comes in like a 30-gallon, like a small drum, about so big. Well, they would weld the ends up on it, and then weld a bicycle pump in the end of it, and then on the other end they'd put a hose, however long your steel was, and they'd put holes on the bottom of it, this round, like a piece of copper or pipe, whatever. So the heat would be indirect. It'd come up like this. Well, they'd fill this thing up with gasoline, imagine 30 gallons of gasoline, and pump it up, and then throw a match down, and just whoo. And
wow.
He said the heat was instant, but it was really volatile.
Yeah.
and he said, like you said, you could hear them across 2 hollows, just kind of a
yeah, it's what he said. It sounded like a jet plane.
Yeah.
And getting back to, you were talking about the molasses. He told me that that those stills, you'd see these these metal cans where they dumped the molasses out during the war because there was a sugar shortage. And one of the quick questions, the time we have left, as a run continues, the proof drops, right, as it goes through. In other words, so how do you get that even proof for, you said you sell yours at 100 proof. How do you maintain that?
Well, we have and even the modern distilleries have what they call the heads and the tails. And after you discard that first one, then I'll start numbering my jugs. I use a gallon jug, and I'll number it like the number 5. And then if everything's going good, I'll dump what's between number 5 and number 40, about 38. I'll dump out all in one 30-gallon drum. And then when I get to about 39 or so, I'll really start watching my proofer. And when it gets to 90, then I'm done. And that way you don't get in the white stuff or the real milky looking whiskey. And but you talk about building proof. Now on this run, okay, when I get that done, then I'll take the mash that's in here and I'll put that back in my barrels. Well, you can do that 3 times, and a lot of the big distilleries do it a lot more than that. But your taste suffers, because what you're doing in the bottom of your barrels, you're building up like a glucose paste, real white paste. And if you let that build up, after say like 4 runs, the taste suffers on it. So then that's where the work comes in. You got to take a corn out, clean the paste out, and then basically start all over again.
Now, in the time we have left, what is your web address?
Oh, you can get there 2 ways: lblmoonshine.com or silvertrail.com, and then we're on Facebook too. And we're having tours. We've had people in from, just 2 days ago, I had a lady from New York call and booked 1st of April to come down and visit us. And this Bourbon Trail thing is really taken off for us. And then with the TV show too. That didn't hurt any, having the #1 TV show on television.
Right,
so,
right.
It's been
What do you think Casey would have thought about tours? I don't think he gave tours of his product.
He probably would have told them, said, well, I've heard somebody did this, or I heard somebody.
Right.
He would have never said, well, I actually built that.
And again, it's amazing when you think of running Moonshine and having tours. Yeah. And we're about out of time, but the one last story, B.J. Hook, I was interviewing him, and they were down this hollow over near, the Golden Pond Visitor Center, and there were a couple of retired revenuers on the hill, and he kept looking at those guys like this and looking until he said, it's all I can do to keep standing here. He said, I've got a powerful urge to run. He said, I've never stayed at a still when I had 2 agents watching me. I mean, it's just a great story.
It was in the genes, I guess.
Yeah.
I got one quick story on my dad. The only time that he really close to getting caught, he said that he was stirring his barrels. Well, this guy in the green suit just walked out and said, you're caught. And he said, for some reason, he stirred it 2 more times, and then he took off. He said he never could figure out why he did that.
Well, you just got to finish up. You got to finish up. And we're out of time. This is a great program, and let's keep in touch. And you had mentioned earlier you may actually set up a still and run it, and we'd love to come over and take pictures.
Yeah, that's what we got in the works. So.
That sounds great. So, my guest today was Spencer Balentine. I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.